Welcome to our session today, which is Design, Right-of-Way, and PI, keeping the communication ball rolling. We have a little interactive exercise to do right away, if April and Tiffany can help me. And I think you two should help me as well, since you're over there. We're going to go ahead and relocate some people. Everyone on this aisle here is going to get relocated. I'm very sorry, we're expanding the roadway, we're moving you. I know you're neighbors and friends, but we're gonna go ahead and split you up. Sorry, I'm so sorry. We're going ahead and relocating you. Construction zone here. Are you relocating? We're gonna move you over, no, we're relocating you, sorry. You're going up front, right up front. Yes, we're widening this roadway. Yeah, don't sit on the aisle. You don't want to buy a house that's getting relocated. It's horrible, awkward.
Oh, lucky Kim.
Augustine's holding out. You got to get relocated. You can't be on the aisle. Sorry. We're in negotiations with you. We're relocating you. We're just relocating on the edges. Welcome, welcome. If you sit on the edges, you're getting relocated. Look, it's already mass confusion. Mass confusion. It's confusing. What's happening? Why are we relocating? Well, this session started out, I asked these wonderful people here to be a part of this session, and once we started talking about communication with right-of-way, design, and public involvement, it was like grabbing the tiger by the tail. Nope, just kidding. Help me, Brian. Next, thank you. I need a mouse. No, there we go. Okay, here's our panel of experts, and James is going to introduce us.
Before I get started, I've got two clipboards that everybody, if you would please take a moment, sign in. Behind the first sheet is also the CEU credits, if you need to participate in that. So we have a, pardon me, sorry, papers flying everywhere. We have several distinguished panel members today who are going to help us out with this PI communication exercise. First, we have Sandy Lampshire. Sandy is a principal at Horrocks Engineers and has served in the industry for 17 years. She holds a bachelor's degree in public relations and oversees Horrocks' marketing and public involvement departments. Big round of applause for Sandy. Eileen Barron is a communications manager for UDOT Region 3. She is the past president of the International Association for Public Participation Intermountain Chapter and a member for the Transportation Research Board Committee on Public Involvement in Transportation. Eileen. Randy Jeffries has been with UDOT for 17 years. Randy has led a number of projects in northern Utah, including Riverdale Road, the I-15 Now project, SR 193 extension, SR 108, Logan Canyon, and the West Davis Corridor. Randy Jeffries. Brian Atkinson has 20 years of experience in transportation engineering and over the past 10 years has served as the project manager or design manager on several of the largest and most complicated urban interstate projects in Utah. Brian. Bethany Shingleton works for HDR and manages their real estate services team in Utah and has 18 years of experience in the design and management of UDOT real estate services and transportation projects. Bethany. And Wayne Larson. Wayne performs right-of-way lead agent services for Horrocks Engineers. His right-of-way experience includes more than 30 years as a real estate appraiser, 22 years of which were in the specialized field of eminent domain partial valuations. Wayne. And I am James Olszewski, the Deputy Director of Right-of-Way and your game show host for this event, which is why all of you got to move around today. So with that, I'm gonna turn the mic back to Sandy, and she's gonna take it from here.
Thanks, James. So really, my goal in doing this session really ended up coming about for selfish reasons. I truly didn't understand the right-of-way process, and I felt confused, and I thought, well, if I devote myself to teaching, maybe I'll learn something. So why is this session needed? One of the things that we talked about was, and you guys can see from our activity how confusing it got right away, of everyone just moving around, different people talking to you and moving. Communication should be the same no matter the size of the project. And we often find that little construction projects to major multi-million-dollar, billion-dollar design-build jobs, communication can differ. Design, right-of-way, and PI often work in silos, and we don't share information from stage to stage. Design, right-of-way, and PI are often not continuous throughout the life of the project. There's different companies working, whether it's environmental phase, design, construction, right-of-way acquisitions. We have a lot of different moving parts and pieces and people, and a lot of times that information doesn't get packaged together and transferred to the next group that's going to be working on the job. Right-of-way is complicated and a very lengthy process. James, you were telling me which projects were you just finally closing out? Yeah, the original I-15. He's just barely closing that out. It could go forever. So for your CEU credits, we just threw in a slide for objectives. We're going to walk you through a typical project process and define the areas where communication gaps exist. And we want you guys to chime in. I want you guys to please raise your hands, comment. I do want to keep this not project specific. We're not here to run over anybody. I think anybody who's dealt with a major project that's had major right-of-way has probably stepped in some sort of communication issue. And I want to keep this situational if we can. Educate on the right-of-way acquisition process. I will have handouts for that available. Discuss best practices for PI design and right-of-way to communicate, and define tools that can help achieve best practices. So cause and effect. Who's the owner's first contact? Can anybody tell me who you think the owner's first contact kind of is? Or who should be the owner's first contact? Exactly. Amen. Good job. I feel like I need a candy bar for you. It's oftentimes a surveyor. James found this great clip.
I think you all know that I always felt the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help.
Can you guys kind of hear that? So let's break down the issues. This is we just really simplified a project, a typical project, from design, concept, report planning, or environmental, so kind of an environmental stage, design, right-of-way acquisition, and construction. As you can see where these non-orange dots are, there's usually places where these groups are not involved in the project, and the one consistent is the property owner throughout, and they're dealing with different people all the time. And it's not consistent all the way through. And then often it's not the same team. I worked on a project in Region 1 where we went through 5 different UDOT project managers because the project was so long. And there's just turnover in companies, there's turnovers within UDOT, there's just lots of different people moving around all the time. So let's talk about planning and environmental stage. We kind of broke down simply the pieces that were happening, and I'm gonna ask our panel, we got together and talked about the planning phase, and I think I'm gonna have Randy start on this first one. Very first part, and you said it, the surveyor's the first one out, and Brian, I'd like you to chime in on this too. Tell me, why is the surveyor the first person that the property owner is seeing? And is that okay? Here, let me give you the mic.
No, I think that's actually a problem if the surveyor is the first person the property owner meets, right? The surveyor is not going to know some of the details of the project that the property owner is going to want to know. So imagine you as an owner, you see some guy in orange in your yard, and you're like, who are you? What are you doing here? You're going to have some questions, and if you're just told that, well, there's a project coming right through your home, or if he doesn't have any answers for you, you're going to be pretty frustrated right off the bat. And if you have a property owner who's frustrated, you know, you can't erase those first impressions. It's going to be an uphill battle from there. And so ideally, we are proactive on that before we have surveyors out in the field, that we have a strategy to reach out to these property owners. Typically, there's some sort of environmental process that's happened. Hopefully, there's some upfront contacts that have been made that can answer the key questions. I think one of the first questions a property owner needs to understand before they're ready to talk about right-of-way issues or values or anything is why. You know, why am I being impacted? Why is this project even needed? And if you can help them to understand that, I think then you can start to talk about how they might be affected and what the right-of-way process is. So hopefully the surveyor is not their first contact.
Yeah, and so even if, you know, depending on the size of the project, sometimes we have to, like Randy said, strategize on how we're going to deal with the property owners. So if we can't get a public involvement group involved to help get that message out, we need to let we have to remember who we're dealing with here. Like Sandy said, that property owner is going to be dealing with this project from cradle to grave, and he's going to see, or she's going to see, you know, different people coming around. So by, you know, doing some simple things, by sending out letters, by arming our surveyors when they go out what the project is. Sometimes we send our surveyors out there and they don't know anything about the project, yet we're sending them out there to deal with the public in that regard. So some, you know, simple things that we can do in that first stage to help, you know, communicate that with a letter that can go out prior to them coming, and then talking to the surveyors and maybe even giving them just a little, you know, cut sheet of simple information so that when those questions get asked, there's some communication there.
This is something that James actually brought up, which is entering public contact information. So as PI professionals, we gather, you know, we pull GIS, we pull parcel data, we create these, you know, and I think every PI group does it very differently, how we gather public contacts. And then what happens, you know, this is a planning stage, this is environmental stage. We are contacting the public, we get all of this information, and we usually know which property owner is more problematic, the ones that are the most angry, and might be more difficult down the road when we get to right-of-way acquisition. How do we flag these, and how can we get those to notify James that these are property owners that are probably going to take a little bit more hand-holding? And you mentioned your EPM.
So one of the things that we're going to start asking the surveyors to do, as well as from the environmental side, is what we call an early upload into EPM. So the surveyors are familiar with this. They go out, they meet with the landowner, they research the properties, and they're putting together a property matrix where it identifies all the owners up and down the corridor. We're going to develop a system. We've got a foundation right now already set up for this, where we can get the owner's information into EPM so that the PI teams, as well as anybody who comes in contact with the owner, can log all that information. So any contact information, any conversation that's had with the landowner can be entered into the system. We have one database with all the information. So it'll be a little bit of a change for both the project managers and the designers to make sure this information comes in early. And where we'd like to get it is actually from the environmental section, because that's where a lot of the information is done to begin with. And
the next thing is something that Eileen brought up, and I think it is wonderful. I'm going to have Eileen talk about that with messaging. Oh, yeah, you're up.
Sure, and I think it's just really important to recognize that even if you're doing a planning study or you're engaged in the environmental process, the property owners that you're interacting with, and sometimes you're dealing with multiple alternatives, so more property owners than maybe will actually eventually encounter acquisition, that first impression happens up front. And trying to be consistent in describing what the process may be, both in terms of the planning and environmental, but also what that property acquisition means, and explaining that, sticking just to, I think, a process messaging to help set people's expectations of what that entails. But what's happening in your planning and environmental stage sticks with those property owners, very clear. And so I think it's of utmost importance to treat them with respect and answer their questions as fully as you can, because it's, you know, their property is so personal to them. And so it can be very emotional, and you're trying to explain facts about roadways. So I think just some extra attention that even in the environmental stage and even back into planning, your interaction with property owners carries all the way through to that actual point of acquisition. And so we need to take special care in how we plan and strategize and communicate with potentially impacted property owners. Kim.
I just wanted to make a comment. On most all of my projects, and I'm in acquisition, I'm a lead agent, so that's in the acquisition phase. When we get the summaries in, we have no data on any property owners, nor do we have their contact information, nor do we know if there's a well that's impacted, nothing. So it's imperative that that information flows through so that I don't have agents taking 2 weeks trying to track down a property owner when all that information is in a database somewhere. And it happens, it's going to be awesome when that is fixed.
So that's a perfect segue. Thank you. When we get to, you know, even in environmental, but more specifically when we get to design, we started really talking about how do we solve this? There's all this data that is really collected in the environmental phase, and usually, you know, when I get a design PI project, I'll go, and there was an environmental document done, I'll go get the environmental document and we'll kind of peruse that, but it's really summary level, you know, high-level resource information. It doesn't really give me the kind of data that we're looking for, and how can we get that data? And one of our ideas is to set up regular meetings between design, PI, and right-of-way, even if they're from the last phase and maybe they're not coming and doing this next phase, to include them, to kind of data dump, and to have that meeting. And I want Brian to maybe elaborate a little bit on the reasons. We went through, each of us talked about, from a right-of-way standpoint, what's your frustrations? From a design standpoint, what's your frustrations? And from PI, what's our frustrations? And I think I'll have each of you guys kind of talk on that. So Brian, I'm going to start with design.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
From a design standpoint, so very often we're starting from scratch when really there's a whole wealth of information out there that has previously been gathered, just like what Kim's saying in acquisition. And so being able to have access to that information, if property owners know of problems out there today, if driveways are in bad locations, if you know, there's water problems or things like that out there, flooding issues, all that information is so helpful for us to know up front rather than learn about it when the acquisition agent's out there and we're at PS&E, and then it's costly and timely to have to make those changes at that point. So again, it's just that communication gap and being able to utilize any of the information that was gathered previously.
And I think it's important to note too, when they start to design the job, there's flexibility in the job. And oftentimes, you know, right away or PI, we don't understand what that flexibility can be. Can they move a driveway? Can they wiggle the line a little to save something? You know, what are those flexibility elements? And I think meeting with a designer up front and understanding, why did they put the road there? Why is this designed this way? What are the constraints that they had in design, so that we can message to the public what those are. Eileen, do you want to, sorry, I hope I didn't just take your answer.
No, that's okay. For me, the key point in design is just really assigning and respecting who speaks to what. And that helps, I think, keep the messaging very clear. It keeps the technical people speaking to technical things. And while public involvement needs to kind of have their arms around everything, and we can help coach our technical team members, you know, we want to stick to explaining the project as a whole, and let the designers answer the questions about how design is formulated. Let right-of-way people answer questions about the details of how right-of-way is acquired. And I think that's one way to really steer clear of getting in that catch-22 when you have that property owner going to Wayne and then Bethany and then me and on down the line trying to find those discrepancies. Well, so-and-so said this and so-and-so said that. Well, if we can each stick to our technical area of expertise, and if they have specific questions that really want to drill down into design, we take them over to the designer. And if they have really specific questions about right-of-way process and just kind of explaining the high level, which I think PI folks ought to stay to the high-level steps in the acquisition process-oriented, we get them over to the right-of-way folks. And if we respect each other's areas of expertise, I think we'll save ourselves a lot of headache.
Can I add just to what Eileen and Brian both said is, we have to remember this collaboration and communication that Sandy's talking about is so important. But engineers, PI, right-of-way folks, we all bring a different perspective. And when we all get in a room together, we find we share a lot of that information, because even as Kim, you mentioned, taking that information and documenting it and putting it in EPM in the right-of-way module is great. But when you sit down and collaborate, people remember other things, discussions that they had, a discussion that a surveyor has. And we can all, you know, not every project is set up so you can all collaborate on a routine basis, but it's amazing. You get all those different disciplines in a room, what you end up coming out with and how much better the communication is.
I just want to say that one of the things I really like about CMGC, as opposed to just design, bid, build, is that sometimes when everything's laid out in scope and design, bid, build, then we run into a situation with the property owners, and some of the problems they have that may have started long ago, you have to solve with money or time. And CMGC, as we're talking about this cooperation and this communication across the board, we get to use engineering solutions. That is a very, very powerful tool, and it works.
Thank you. Let me, Eileen talked about defining internal communications for public contact, who's answering what question, and that's really important, I think, for PI people to remember. There are some legal and not legal things that we can say concerning right-of-way, and I would hate to see any public involvement person getting themselves in trouble by communicating right-of-way information out in the field, not understanding what's legal and not legal to talk about. Yeah.
So, you know, at the same time, we do need to make sure that our PI people, I mean, obviously, if for every question the PI person can't say, well, let me call somebody and I'll get that answer for you. And, you know, there needs to be some general project information the PI people need to know, the right-of-way agent needs to know, the designer needs to know, you know, how many lanes is this road going to be? What are we trying to accomplish here? You know, the PI should be able to answer basic right-of-way questions, and one of the things that I think has come out of this, and I'm sure Sandy will explain, is just some basic FAQs, right-of-way process information that hopefully designers and PI people, it'll be consistent for the whole department. I mean, I've got several projects, seems like on every project we have a right-of-way information FAQ sheet, and it's like, well, the answers don't change from project to project, and so trying to make sure that as an industry, those that work on UDOT projects have those types of answers, but we don't get into talking about the details, the values. We don't talk about super elevation of curves unless you're an expert, but at least we have the answers to the main questions. And that will give some reassurance to the property owners that we know what we're trying to accomplish, gives them confidence in UDOT. It helps us to demonstrate that we are trying to serve them, trying to help them, and not just trying to pass the buck to someone else. So.
And I'll just add, I think for most people, those higher level answers satisfy their need for information. But I will counter that with just, it's your property owners who are anticipating some kind of direct impact that really want to get into the details. And so those are folks, I think, then you want to connect with the design team, with the agents, and not try to go there ourselves as a PI staff member.
So this was really hard to make. It took a while. Wayne was very helpful, and I tried to Wayne had a great process chart written from an acquisitions point of view, and I tried to take some of the really technical things out of it and make it a little bit more simple. I do want to get this to everybody that attends, but I want to talk with James about possibly adding some time frames on here, and we do have some ideas, because I do think time frames would really help when you guys are setting up schedules. Some of these things take 30 days. Some of them are flexible, and I think that's something that we're going to vet out and then publish, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But James, do you want to walk us through this bad boy? It's complicated.
So you start at go, and you start working around the board. And when you get to go to jail and do not pass go, then you end up in right-of-way acquisition. So,
please note it doesn't have any relocation either, and that's when it really gets complicated.
We didn't even try to tackle design build, which I guess is slightly different. I'm like, let's just try to take the most simple process.
so we actually sat down, and we had a big, huge whiteboard. And we were drawing all the different processes and the steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it became very obvious to them when I'm going, okay, there's this step, and then suddenly you have to go over here, and then come back up to this step, and then come over to here. And years ago, the Salt Lake Tribune, when the original I-15 project was being built, had a little cartoon. And I couldn't find it because I was going to post it up here, but it was a great cartoon. And it showed all of the UDOT engineers working on I-15, and they were talking, hey, if we close this off-ramp here and we close this on-ramp here, nobody can get off of I-15 and they'll be stuck there forever. And the irony is, I-15 became a luge, and it almost happened. So the irony was, how do we get from point A to point B? And there are so many moving parts to this. And what we created was some very simple, high-level steps. We start with the design. Who does what? The designers start creating the roadway improvements. They turn over the information to the right-of-way designers. They start creating the impacts. They're the ones who actually define what needs to be taken, whether it's a fee acquisition for additional right-of-way or whether it's perpetual easements. And then are there temporary construction easements that need to go with it? They start creating all the documents. And it flows through the whole process of who gets to talk to whom. At what point does the landowner get contacted again? The appraiser has very specific duties. He has to walk the project with the landowner. That's by state law. The landowner is very aware then of what is starting to happen to his project, and he's going to get a little nervous. And if the surveyor was the first one who contacted him and said, yeah, dude, they're going to come and they're going to bulldoze your house, guess what he's thinking? When is the bulldozer showing up? So what we want to do is make sure we're messaging the right information and get it all the way through to where finally Kim or her agents, they're the ones knocking on the door, and like we saw Ronald Reagan, which is my favorite quote, knock, knock, knock. Hi, I'm with the government. I'm here to help you. I mean, really, that's not the message that we want the landowner to hear. We are coming, and as was mentioned earlier, land is personal. It gets emotional when we're dealing with landowners and their rights. And getting them past the emotional phase becomes a critical step. How do we do that? How do we walk them through this nice gradual, we're coming, we're going to buy your property, you're going to have a new cool road when we're done, and you're going to love it. and it's going to be awesome. How do we message that? So this literally became a big, huge process of finally getting down to where, as I said, the agent is actually negotiating with the landowner, and then we have a couple options. We have those owners who are like, yeah, for 99% of you who were not in the previous session with me and Wayne, we talked about incentive payments, of how we can help move the landowner into a, what we want to say, a quicker determination for signing the right-of-way contract. Incentives are great on some projects, they don't work on all projects. But the bottom line is we need to get the property owner to sign one of two things. Either a permission to get me on the property so I can construct, or a right-of-way contract. If I don't get either one of those two, then what happens? Somebody say it louder.
It's the red arrow.
It's the red arrow. Negotiations are not successful. We have one of two things. We send them to the ombudsman's office for alternative dispute resolution, or we have to condemn. Condemnation is not a bad thing. It is a public right. It's one of the rights you as a citizen of the United States has. It's a great right. It works, and it's very beneficial. It allows you to contest the project and contest the valuation. Not a bad thing. But the key is I'm still trying to get the contractor with the bulldozer on the project. How do we get there? Because ultimately, we're going to come down to two different areas. These two boxes here is the ultimate. A, advertising the project with limitations, or B, I've bought all the property we need and we can advertise and the contractor can go forth and conquer the world. And we're happy about that. Now, as Sandy mentioned, I stripped off all the timelines because some of them are embedded by state code. And we need to make sure we're careful about what those actually mean and what's going to happen. Others, unfortunately, there's, right-of-way has a favorite buzzword. It depends. It depends on the acquisition. It depends on what's happening. There's a lot of variables that go into place.
This was really hard to do. There was a lot of it depends. Well, what do you mean? Just give me a process.
So, but the nice thing is we've got a flow chart that, I mean, we used to have a very simple one. It was point A to point B. And a lot of squiggly lines in between, kind of like the earthquake center. This kind of gets us where we need to be. So as Sandy mentioned, we're going to actually get timelines on this, and we're going to hand this out. And we want to use this on every single project that will have right-of-way on it. This way, the project managers, the PI, the acquisition agents, everybody understands what is happening. So this is going to be a new handout that's going to be used, and we're actually also going to get onto a mobile app so you can actually scan it, throw it up, see it, and everybody understands these are the processes. Now again, this is flying at 30,000 feet. This isn't getting into, you're going to pay me how much? We haven't even talked about that. It is strictly.
I took incentives off because they vary. They were kind of on here, and I'm like, I'm just going to go take those off.
Hang on, Juan. Hang on. Wait.
So if it's a process, why isn't it in a PDN?
It is part of the PDN. Because the irony is, in the PDN, we have several parts that talk about acquisition, relocation, and the appraisal process. This gets into a little bit more of the specifics as far as how do we do that. So each of these steps is not a PDN step by themselves, and you don't want that. For appraisal and acquisition and relocation, yes, that stuff is there. But this will help guide and help provide information to the public. This is a different. This isn't just step A to step B to step C. This is going to help you and your team explain the right-of-way process to the landowners and make sure we're communicating the same message. So the PDN is one issue. This is going to help in another area.
If it takes time and money, it should be in the PDN.
It is. So again, the acquisition, those steps are all in the PDN, and they're actually in the right-of-way contracting method as well. So they're in the system.
So let's talk about the right-of-way acquisition phase, which usually starts somewhere mid-design, correct? As you can see, right-of-way designers have kind of fallen off, and public involvement is now not involved very typically. We back away from property owners, right-of-way steps in, and what are some things that we can do to make that better? One of which, Brian, I'm going to have you elaborate on the meeting before appraisal and why that should happen.
Yeah, so both the designer that's setting the design up determining cut and fill, driveway limits, a lot of the impacts that are involved with the property owner. He does that sitting at his computer in MicroStation and doesn't really communicate how he came about those decisions to a lot of people. Two people in particular. One is the surveyor who's writing the instruments. Even though they can generally do that without a ton of information, it's so much more helpful if they know all the information. There's a lot that goes into those instruments that having that knowledge would make things go a lot better. And then two, the appraiser who has to go out there and interview and walk the property with the property owner. So again, this is where the emotion comes in, and the property owner really wants to know what's going on. But generally that appraiser is looking at a 2D blank or 2D piece of paper with the design laid out on it, and being able to convey the information of what's really going on from that is really hard for them. So if we could meet with those appraisers as a designer and as the surveyor who wrote the instrument before they went out, I think it would be really beneficial to get them up to speed on exactly what's going on with that property. And again, I think it's going to help convey some of that flexibility where they're, as they begin to negotiate that acquisition. I think it'll help know where the boundaries are of what can and can't be done in that negotiation.
And I think it's helpful to have PI there because they've been speaking so far face-to-face with these owners. They know what they care about, what's the sacred cow on their property, if it's just some easements or some strip takes, what are some of the things that are musts for these property owners in conveying that. Yeah, Kim.
Just a quick question. Do the engineers that are sitting in their cubicles doing the design, do they ever go look at the property?
That's a good question. We encourage them to. Whether every engineer does, I can't, but they should, yes.
Not always.
Not always, but they should. Yeah.
You would think that'd be obvious, right? And I think you know, that spreadsheet and some of the stuff we're talking about today is the what. You know, what is the process? What's the next step? But there's, I think, more than what, it's how we approach right-of-way acquisition. If Carlos were here, he would say that condemning or buying people's property is the scariest power that UDOT has. And we want to make sure that we use that very carefully. And I think it comes down to respecting the property owner. There's a right that we are asking them to give up. And we have the power to take that from them. And so out of respect for the property owner, we should go out, have the designer, and go look at the property. We should meet with the designer and the PI and get to know what potential concerns the property owners could have, how they would like to be treated. One helpful thing before appraisals start, we talk about cost to cure items. We sometimes, you know, you may be on a project where you have a lot of residents and they don't want to deal with trying to find a landscaping sub to fix their sprinklers and fencing sub and all this stuff. And sometimes we can serve the property owners to make their life a little easier, and we can have our contractor take that and we can say, you know what, on all these residential parcels, we're going to cover all the cost to cure in the contract, so don't worry about appraising that. But then you may have commercial properties where they're going to want to use their property management to take care of cost to cure. And so every property is a little unique, and I think they deserve the respect to spend some time to just talk about before we start to appraise and start to the right-of-way acquisition process.
Thank you. Speaking of cost to cure, do we have some questions?
Yeah, I do have a question before you leave this.
Do it. Go for it.
So you have under right-of-way acquisition, sends a letter to property owner. And I have a question regarding the timing of this. If you've done an environmental document and you're going to take that property and you know that after that, but maybe there's a lag between environmental and getting the funding for design or construction, does right-of-way send a letter to property owners saying, okay, we have our preferred alternative and we've got a big red dot on your property? Do they get that before the design process?
Who wants to answer? You guys are all pointing at each other.
Nobody wants to field the tough questions. This is actually an easy question. So there's actually several different letters that go out. The one letter that's shown here is the initial offer letter, or the initial letter, or the contact information letter that right-of-way kicks out, informing the landowner that we're going to come, we're going to present an offer, and everything that's about that, which is a little different than what you were talking about. Now, as far as when the environmental is done, is there a letter informing them of several things? Number one, is there a public meeting? Is there a public hearing, and these are all the impacts, and your home may or may not be impacted? That's a great question. That's when I get to come back to you and to your boss and say, Brandon, are we kicking out that letter or are we not? And is it automated, or what do we have to do with that? Because from right-of-way standpoint, that's what environmental should be doing, is all the landowners in the project area should be informed that they are potentially impacted by one or more of the alternatives.
Let me ask Nicole, you do tons of environmental documents for us. Is there a letter that goes out if the property's got an X on it on the map? They show up to the meeting. If they show up, what happens if they don't come to the meeting? That might be one of the communication gaps that we're looking at, though, is if somebody doesn't look at their mail, doesn't unaware of the project, maybe they are, they own the home, but they have renters in it, and the renter's gotten all the information. They have no idea that there's an X on their house from the environmental stage. And I think that's something, that's when I said when we started doing this session, and I felt like we grabbed the tiger by the tail, there's so many gaps.
And is that recorded? Is there any notice that is legally, on a deed or anything
That someday in the future.
On a deed, no. Nothing is recorded in the county as far as that goes. So from that standpoint, nothing is officially with the counties or made a public record. The only public information is the actual environmental document itself. Now, this is where it becomes a challenge, because if you're not doing a full environmental document where you need a ROD or an EIS or an SEIS, and all you're doing is a CAD-X, sorry, I was going to buzz with that, everybody understands the buzzwords, a simplified or streamlined environmental process, most of this information doesn't come out. And so this is what we were talking about earlier. We do public involvement on big projects. We want to change that. The whole focus behind this is on any project that has right-of-way, we want public involvement. Whether that public involvement is the region public guy, so like in Region 1, it's Vic. He's the guy we want to have everybody talking with and back and forth. On the bigger projects where we actually have PI teams, we want this to happen. So it doesn't matter what the project is, because one of the things you'll know, we've seen the landowners who are emotionally charged. Those who come to the meetings and they're ready to go. When we first started Malibu Corridor, we actually had to have armed security guards at the public hearings because the landowners were that upset. We've had others where they're excited, they can't wait. When you come by me tomorrow. I mean, you get the swing on both sides, and it's the same thing even with the acquisition. You hear the horror stories. You don't hear the successes. We turn landowners we turn renters into landowners. We never hear about that. We don't hear the success. We don't hear the story that, grandma got moved and we moved her and the whole family is happy because we took care of the issues. What you hear about is the guy who's ticked off. You hear about the guy who pulled the gun on our agents and doesn't want anything to do with it.
So to avoid that, we would really like right-of-way acquisition agents and PI to attend the first property meeting together. It's something that we're trying to promote. There's lots of benefits to this, and I think, Eileen, can you elaborate on maybe the benefits of that?
Yeah, I think the main point here is that the property owner understands who they go to for what, and that they've seen the PI folks at public meetings through the environmental process and so forth. And so there's that PI representative who can speak to the project and what's happening and why the project is happening and the benefits of the project, alongside your right-of-way agent, who you're kind of making a handoff to that right-of-way agent being their primary point of contact for the details of the acquisition process. And I think going forward, being very clear that your right-of-way agent is who you're going to talk to about all your personal financial information and your assets and all of those nitty-gritty details, and the PI needs to stay completely out of that. But if they still have questions about, well, now why do you need this much space, then go to that PI representative who can talk to the project. And it might be a one-on-one meeting, or in the case of Mountain View Corridor, we did this kind of on a neighborhood-by-neighborhood basis, where we invited people to come and hear about the process and meet their agent. We actually had them sit at a table and meet the agent in a neutral location rather than knocking on their doorsteps. And so, you know, what shape and form this takes place, whether it's an individual meeting or a group meeting, I think can be on a case-by-case basis, but the point is that the property owner understands I'm transitioning from a PI representative from a project to this acquisition agent as my primary point of contact.
People fear what they don't know, and if that goes on long enough, that's where it turns into rage, and that's sometimes what we find in right-of-way. And I like the idea of having a public involvement person as a point person, because they're there to actually feed the information or get the information later on. And guess what? After it's handed off to right-of-way, we acquire the property, then comes the construction. And sometimes there might be miscommunications there, and guess who's there to help out? The PI person. Make connections and make the right connections with the contractor and get things settled that way, so that rage never starts up again.
And that's our next slide, which is construction. Continued meetings between right-of-way and PI. Like James was saying, PI can go on for a really, really long time, even past construction. And so throughout construction, having the PI and right-of-way continue to have their contact. I'm in a book here for a minute. We're running out of time. Benefits of best practices: saves time, saves money, avoids lawsuits, avoids confusion in the field. And just so you guys know, moving forward, this is just the beginning of a major discussion. I've actually talked with Joe Walker in the communications office about creating some sort of task force to really try to create some tools and some methods to make this better. How can we get this on your design process? How do we make these actual steps that have to happen to make things easier as we move forward? One of the things that our group here is committed to doing is to getting that right-of-way acquisition process, that board that you saw, as an internal document up on UDOT's website to be used. Right-of-way frequently asked questions. I mean, how many have generated those? I think every PI group's generated some frequently asked questions concerning right-of-way. There's so many, and Bethany was great, and Eileen sent us all of the ones for Mountain View Corridor. I'm starting to just gather this giant pile of frequently asked questions. I think we can come up with a really good sheet that PI and others can use moving forward for the public. Right-of-way terminology, we've come across, what does cost to cure mean? People don't know what these things mean. They don't understand their rights. They don't get it. And I think UDOT's current manual of law that gets handed, the booklet that gets handed out to people is so overwhelming, especially if they're elderly. I've seen that a lot on projects where they just don't understand and it's too much for them, and we need to simplify that process. And so we want to work with UDOT and the communication and as an industry to try to create some better tools to hand out to the public, something that's a little bit more easy to understand. Any questions before we wrap up? Yeah. I'm running. I'm glittering and running.
This is just generally, I think, a comment in support of this integration of how we're communicating with our stakeholders throughout the whole process of a project being developed. I had the opportunity several years ago as a UDOT consultant to work on a couple of projects where we did this. And it was just so powerful because for about a year before the appraisers came out to talk with folks and the right-of-way agents came out to talk, we had built this trust and rapport with stakeholders that paid dividends in the long run. One thing that you may want to consider when you're looking at this process is how much information, and I think it's really smart to share information about stakeholders to the designers right away, all that. But how much information you share to the appraisers. When it came time on 2 projects for appraisers to go out and talk with folks, they asked for my database of stakeholders and all the interactions I had had with these folks for a year. And we made a strategic decision on those projects not to share the detailed information about each stakeholder, just because we wanted to allow the appraisers to retain that independence, that third party, you know, so that they didn't have any bias when they read the notes. If there was a particular stakeholder that was really difficult to deal with and they had read all of that information, that might bias them a little bit when they were making their appraisals. So that was something that we decided not to do, but we did still go out with the appraisers and meet with our stakeholders together because we had that trust.
That's a great point. Well, I think as we move forward and we're really looking at this, I would really like to put together a task force. So if anybody's interested in participating, I really want to get together as an industry and try to make this process a little bit easier for every phase of the project, create some better tools and items to use for all of us. So we don't have to continue to reinvent the wheel or cause any confusion like our game in the beginning showed. It gets very confusing when you're moving people around. Any other last questions?
Oh, okay. Well, no, you know, really, you know, thinking about what we do as professionals in this industry, you know, we affect a lot of people. Obviously, if we delay people 10 minutes on the road, that they're a stakeholder and they're affected in their lives. But I don't know if anybody is quite as affected as what we do when we are buying property from them. And, you know, we talk about the public trust. I mean, how important it is for us to work together to make sure that at the end of the job, the people trust UDOT more. And it comes down to sometimes just one person on a project to post something on Facebook and our trust is shot. And so I think we really need to be careful and realize what's at stake and respect the process and really dedicate time to this on the PI side, on the design side, on the right-of-way side, and think through that before we just kind of jump into this. And so hopefully this effort will start to be a little bit more emphasized, and we can try to streamline it and make it a great experience to help build trust for the department. So thanks.
Thanks, that's it, guys. We're gonna put